let's do this. So we've been talking on the topic or area of faith. We've been going through and understanding what it is. We've been having an understanding of what authority we have. We've also been going through and getting an understanding that if we don't exercise our authority, then someone else will, and that someone else is the devil, right? And so part of that is going through and saying, okay, well, where's the crux in this? How does that happen? So that we can begin to recognize what that looks like, so that we can take back, or rather not take back, but rather exercise our authority instead of giving it away for someone else to use it, or something else in this case. So last week we were going through, and let's turn over to 1 Peter, because we're going to kind of start there. And we tiptoed through Mark chapter 4 as well. But I want to go back in 1 Peter chapter 5, because there's something here that we're just starting to scratch the surface on. So 1 Peter chapter 5, we're going to begin reading in verse 5. Bravo, this is where it says, God resists the proud but gives grace to the humble. Keep that in mind as we go through, because there's a lot more to just that simple statement of God resists the proud but gives grace to the humble. Because when God is able to give his ability to an individual, verse 6 takes place, or because that's a principle, God gives grace to the humble. Okay, that's a principle. Let's be clear on that. Therefore, humble yourselves on the mighty hand of God. So because God's able to give his grace to the humble yourselves under his mighty hand. Not rocket science, right? That he may exalt you in due time. Okay? Part of this process is casting your care upon him. Now, the care that he's referring to here is going to be the distractions, right? We've already gone through that. It's the merimna. It's the division or distraction. Cast all your care upon him, for he cares for you. Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, walks like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. So there's something here in that if we're proud and or then it's impossible for God to give us his grace or his ability. Even when we are humble, and we approach and humble ourselves under his mighty hand, that he may exalt us in due time, in that process, there's going to be a tempting or testing or trying of introducing a double-mindedness to someone. Because the instant that the devil can do that, he's got you. Because a double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. Okay? So he says, casting your care upon him, for he cares for you. So this division or distraction, that's what we have to cast and get ourselves out of that scenario and have a proper response, if you will. Because if we take on that division or distraction, which is in this case the word care, merimna, we become devourable to the devil, because that division or distraction that he's placed in our lives enables the principle, which is, let not that man suppose he'll receive anything from the Lord. Okay? Now, we know the solution is resist him, remaining steadfast in the faith, right? Now turn over to James, because I want to go get further into James. Yeah, let's go to James. Well, we're going to pause there. Let's go to Corinthians. It just keeps coming up in my heart, and I'm not going to skip that. So go to 2 Corinthians. I believe chapter 10. Just give me a second here. Nope, I lied. Chapter 12. Because I want to show you something here. And lest I be exalted above measure. Okay, of course, this is the account of Paul, right? He's going through in chapter 11, verse 23. Go there. Are they 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 23? Are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool. I am more. In labors more abundant, in stripes above measure, in prisons more frequent, in deaths often. From the Jews I received 40 stripes minus 1, 39 stripes. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. At night and day I've been in the deep, in journeys often, in perils of waters, in perils of robbers, in perils of my own countrymen, in perils of... The dude was in perils. Okay? Now when you turn the page, you know what? Keep going. Perils of wilderness, in perils of seas, in perils among false brethren, verse 27 of 2 Corinthians chapter 11. In weariness and toil and sleeplessness often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness, besides other things what comes upon me daily, my deep concern for all the churches. Who is weak? I am not weak. Who is made to stumble? And I do not burn with indignation. Now look what he says here in verse 30. Because this is what ties to this next chapter. If I must boast, I will boast when? In the things concerning my infirmity. It does not say about. I want to be very clear. It does not say about. Oh God, thank you for putting this on me, for teaching me something. Nope, it's not what he's saying there. He boasts in his infirmities. Okay, keep that in mind. If I must boast, I will boast in the things which concern my infirmities. Now, turn the page, and we're going to go into that, because I want to explain that to you, which we've taught here before. I just want to go through it again. 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Okay? And lest I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelations, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of who? Satan. Okay, so if it's a messenger of Satan, who do you think sent it? Satan, right? It's a messenger of Satan. Satan sent it. So it's not God. God did not send this thing to him. So a messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I be exalted above measure. So he makes that exact same statement in the first part of that verse 7, and lest I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelations, which means this. He had spent so much time praying in the Spirit, so much time worshiping, so much time fellowshipping with God, that the revelation knowledge that Paul had accumulated enabled him to literally write the majority of the New Testament, obviously inspired by God. That was very frustrating to the devil, because when you read through Peter, and it goes through that he actually, Paul withstood Peter to his face. Peter was trying to take the whole church back under works instead of it you being saved by grace. And Paul's like, no, it's by grace you have been saved. You've been saved by grace, not by works. And so because he literally was turning the church back to the proper way that God had set it up, he had a level of revelation on that he had spent enough time with God, that God had revealed to Paul. And as a result of that, this messenger of Satan was assigned to him to take him out. Okay, now they call it basically a principality, which is something that's in charge of an entire nation, to indoctrinate a nation. The highest level of of devil in the devil's army was assigned to Paul. Okay, you look at like all your Eastern religions, you look at your New Age Western religions, you look at all that's the hierarchy of what we're talking about here. And because that one principality was assigned to Paul, in that chapter 11, verse 23, is what he had went through. Now, Paul was at breaking points at multiple points in this, of these attacks. Which is why it says in verse 8, concerning this thing, well, what was the thing? The messenger of Satan that was sent to buffet me. Concerning that, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me. Now, it took Paul 3 times to get it. It wasn't just like I asked God and I got it, just understood it. It took him 3 times to understand. And this is what the statement that God made to him. He said, Paul, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. And we've gone through that. It talks about worship. In that, my strength is made perfect in weakness. In that his grace or cherish or joy is sufficient for you. So when we reproduce joy in the heart of the Father, that's all that needed to be done, because it's at that point, when we worship God, that his presence begins to exchange our weaknesses for God's strengths. And it wasn't until Paul realized that God said, hey, look, my grace is all you need. My ability is what you need here. My joy is what you need here, and the way that you create joy is by worshiping me. And when you do that, then my ability is what exchanges your weaknesses for God's ability or his strengths. Because of that, most gladly I will rather boast when? In my infirmities. Okay, hold your place there. Flip the page back, if your page is flippable, to chapter 11, verse 30. If I must boast, I will boast when? In the things which concern my infirmities. So Paul was on to something here. In the middle of being attacked, he made the choice to remain steadfast in the faith. There was a way at which he responded in all of these attacks that enabled him to remain steadfast in the faith. One of the ways is by worshiping God. When he produced joy in the heart of the Father, God's strength was made perfect in his weaknesses. In other words, God's grace was given to him. God's ability was given to him. Okay, and as we continue reading on there, it says, therefore, because when I worship God and I boast in my infirmities, when I worship God in that state, the power of Christ, verse 9, latter part of verse 9, the power of Christ may rest upon me. Okay, so the power of Christ rests upon him when he worships or boasts about God in his infirmities. When those weaknesses, in those attacks that are taking place, when he does that, when he worships God, the power of Christ rests upon him. That is a principle. That does not change. So part of what the devil doesn't want to take place is for someone to worship God in the middle of those circumstances, in the middle of those quote-unquote infirmities, those weaknesses, those areas where Satan's buffeting you. He's doing that to create a division of one-mindedness. A double-mindedness is what he's attempting to do. And he wants to get someone to the point where they do not worship God in their infirmities. Because when they do, the power of Christ rests upon them. God's ability shows up. Because that's a principle, that when I worship God and I boast about God in my infirmities, Because it's not talking about boasting about my infirmities. It's that in that state is when I boast. Well, what are you boasting about? God, I worship you and glorify you. You are my healer if you're going through an area where you need health, where your sickness is trying to steal your health. If your peace of mind is being stolen, then that's what you worship. Jesus, you provide peace. My peace I give to you, not as the world gives do I give. My peace I leave with you. So the ability of God that he's made available to us when we were born again, as part of that inheritance that we were talking about in Ephesians, we have to be able to access, okay? So therefore I take pleasure in infirmities. Well, why would he even make that statement? He didn't say I take pleasure about my infirmities. I take pleasure in them. Why? I take pleasure in the infirmities. I take pleasure in reproaches. I take pleasure in needs. I take pleasure in persecutions. I take pleasure in distresses. Why? Let's say it another way. I worship and glorify God in the infirmities. I worship and glorify God in the reproaches. I worship and glorify God in the needs. I worship and glorify God in persecutions, in distresses. Why? For the power of Christ's sake. Because in verse 9 it says, the power of Christ may rest upon me. So in verse 10 it says, for when I am weak, then I am strong. What he's saying is that when I'm in that weakened state, when I am being attacked, when the opportunity to have double-mindedness presents itself, I'm going to choose to worship God. Now, hold your place there and go back to 1 Peter. Because I want to make this correlation. God resists the proud but gives grace to the humble. Someone who is humble, like it says in verse 6, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God. What does that mean? Well, if you're under his hand, that means you got to go towards him. Does it not? I mean, if you're not going to be under God's hand, you're not going to be walking in his direction. So we begin to head in his direction. And while you're heading in that direction, part of that is worshiping him. Like Paul just did. Because he's able to, therefore, humble yourselves in the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time. Now, hold your place there and flip back to Corinthians. 2 Corinthians. I lost my page, sorry. 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Therefore, most gladly, I would rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore, I take pleasure in infirmities and reproaches and needs and persecutions and distresses. For what? For Christ's sake. That's 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9 and 10. Okay, now, keeping that in mind, now let's go over to James. The whole point of tonight's conversation, if you will, message, whatever you want to call it, is that we have to understand how to humble ourselves under God's mighty hand that he may exalt us in due time. How, by doing that, it enables us to have access to the truth that God gives grace to the humble. Okay, so now look over in James. James. Now, I want you to look over in James chapter 4. Look in verse 6. But he gives more, what? Grace. Therefore, he says what? God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Isn't that the exact same thing that we just read in Peter? Resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble, right? We look on 1 Peter chapter 5. God resists the proud but gives grace to the humble. Okay? Therefore, submit to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Now, I want you to underline or highlight that, and then also verse 8, draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Okay? That 6, 7, and 8 is the entire premise of the book of James. He just summed the entire book up of James in those 3 simple verses. Now, in knowing that, we're going to start reading in James chapter 1 with the understanding that God resists the proud, gives grace to the humble, and how to submit ourselves to God, how to resist the devil, how do we draw near to God so that he draws near to us. Okay? Which, of course, he just answers right there. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Okay, so part of that is ensuring that we do not have double-mindedness, right? Now let's go back to James chapter 1. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. Okay? What's one of the things when you come to God and you humble ourselves under him, what is he going to provide to you? He's going to provide to you his wisdom of how he does things. If you want to have the God kind of results, you have to have the God kind of wisdom. In order to have the God kind of wisdom, wisdom is comprised of how he does things. If you want to have his wisdom, what's the first, which is basically his belief system on how he does things? What is the basis of a belief system? It's words. It's words. Words produce thoughts, thoughts produce knowledge, knowledge has an emotional tie-in, which then you have a belief system which causes someone to act. And then they have self-talk, which is the words that completes the cycle. So if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives all liberally without reproach, and it will be given to him. But let him ask in faith with no doubting. For he who doubts is like a wave of the sea driven and tossed by the wind. For let not that man suppose he will receive anything from the Lord. Now, of course, we understand that basically that 6, 7, 8 is going through and it's establishing a principle that we have to understand, which is that verse 8, he is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. If someone is double-minded, verse 7 takes place, let not that man suppose he will receive anything from the Lord. So the double-mindedness is what the devil is wanting to introduce into us through the distractions and divisions in order for us to no longer have that single-mindedness, which is basically saying to remain steadfast in the faith, which is basically saying that the response that we have is going to be the works that is going to be demonstrated from the faith that we have in our heart. If the works that we do, because it's based off of the belief system that we have, the works that James is inferring about is the response that we have when an attack takes place. When you respond correctly, God has the ability to respond in like kind in your life. How? He's able to perform his word with signs following. It's that simple. So the instant that we're not getting the God kind of results, we have to go back to the original principles that exist, which enable God to move. So now let's go on. Let's keep that in mind as we continue moving forward. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. Let the lowly brother glory in his exaltation. So he goes through a bunch of, he goes off a little bit here. Glory in his exaltation, but the rich in his humiliation. Because a flower of the field will pass, as a flower of the field, he will pass away. This is basically talking about if you're, look at verse 11. For no sooner has the sun risen, that's the verse I wanted to read. For no sooner has the sun risen with a burning heat that it withers the grass, its flower fails, and its beautiful appearance perishes. So the rich man will also fade away in his pursuits. Blessed is the man who endures temptation, for when he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life which the Lord has promised to those who love him. Verse 13, let no one say when I am tempted by God. Okay, so now we're going through, and the first thing he's talking about is the testing of your faith. Right, that's in verse 3. When you fall into various trials, it's a testing of your faith. Why would he say count it all joy when you fall into various trials? Do you remember what we just read? What Paul just went through what Paul was talking about in 2 Corinthians chapter 12? What do you mean by counting it all joy? Think about it now. When you worship God, right? That's what you're boasting about what Paul was boasting about in his infirmities. Verse 13, let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone. Okay, so he's getting the record straight here. This 13 and 14 is so important. Let no one say when he is tempted, verse 13, I am tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone, what? With evil. But each one is tempted when he's drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Then when desire is conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. Do not be deceived, my brethren, every good gift. Okay, so Paul makes a statement here. He says, look, when you're being tempted and tried, it ain't from God. Pardon me, Mom. It isn't from God. Because the instant that God becomes the problem, he cannot be the solution. Either God's a healer or he's not. Because the instant that we believe that God is the source and the problem, we've just become double-minded. It is now impossible for God to perform his word because it would mean that God would have to change. And God does not change. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. Then when desire brings forth, it conceives birth to sin. Sin, when it's full grown, brings forth death. He reiterates what he just says. Do not be deceived, my brethren. Every good gift, every perfect gift is from where? Above, and comes down from where? The Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow of turning. We have to make sure that we have verse 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17 in our hearts. Because if we don't, we've just allowed ourselves to be double-minded. We hear the statement, God's in complete control. Show me in the Bible where it says that, because it doesn't say it anywhere. Not that I've been reading. I've been reading this thing for the last, at least 35 years. Well, that's a fib. 30 years. 30 years I've been studying this. Just reading and passing through, and I've never, ever seen God's in complete control. That is a mistruth that will create double-mindedness in someone. Think about it. God's in complete control and someone is sick. What does that mean? In that thought process, it's that God put that sickness on you. He's in complete control. So did he put it on you, or does he want you healthy? Which is it? Is he your healer, or does he give you sickness? Which is it? Because it can't be both. It's one or the other. That's why James makes this statement twice within a matter of 4 verses. Twice he makes a statement. Because that belief system is what was creeping into the church at that particular point in time. He wouldn't have addressed it if that wasn't what was taking place back then. Now you go into different churches and they preach that and serve it up like that's the truth. And the reality is, it couldn't be further from the truth. Because if you believe that, you are being double-minded. Let not that man suppose he will receive anything from the Lord. We're going to pause there because we're going to get further into this chapter. But we're going to pause there for now. And we'll be able to pick up this next week. Father, I just thank you for this time to be able to get into your word. Thank you for this time to be able to continue our journey further into you. I ask your hand be upon each and every one of our lives in Jesus' name. Amen.